Hey there, Jim Johnson from accenthelp.com and finishing up the diphthongs, or almost finishing them up. So, potentially finishing up the diphthongs, where we have finally the choice diphthong, oi, oi. This is the way that you'll tend to see it written in pronouncing dictionaries, and just as with all the other ones that we talked about, you might see it written with this shortening suprasegmental. It's kind of like a diacritic, a little tweak to say that it's shorter. It doesn't last as long because it's the more reduced, the lesser element of the diphthong. The second half tends to be shorter. So this is the way that you will tend to see it written, which can be more than a little confusing. As I mentioned in the intro to diphthongs, when we talked about the thought sound, the single vowel, the thought, which you can look back at the vowel ones if you want to dive into that, thought, or what might also get realized in some other words. You might think of it as the New York sort of coffee vowel. Most Americans don't round it that much. Thought. It tends to get more open. So this is a diacritic for reduced lip rounding. If I put it this way, it means more lip rounding. So for a New Yorker, I might write it this way. So in some ways, choice feels like maybe choice, thought. It might be more like that. So maybe I need to write it with the additional lip rounding. So that's one way to look at it. There's a reason that with thought, I thought of it as the symbol you'll tend to see in pronouncing dictionaries and then reduced lip rounding. This one, we could think of it that way. Once in a while, I'll see people transcribe it more as this, the O that we talked about in the goat diphthong. Go, O. Again, most Americans don't round it that much. Goat, so you can't necessarily base it on your own pronunciation of it, but go, don't ya know, o, oi. This might actually be more accurate, although when we do this symbol as a cardinal vowel, the way that it would be realized with this full rounding, it may sort of take care of that on its own. It's a pain, the fact that this is the symbol that's tended to get used, even though it can be realized incredibly different. And we'll talk about this again when we get into vowels plus R. So the biggest thing that I would say is realize how rounded this sound is, and don't be thrown by how unrounded this sound tends to be for most American speakers in their pronunciation. But otherwise, with choice, there doesn't tend to be a lot of variation in American accents. And even really when you get to other accents around the world, there doesn't tend to be nearly as much variation in this diphthong. It's also the one that doesn't occur as much or as many times as the other diphthongs that we've already talked about. So this is like a less common one that doesn't have as much variation on it. So I thought I'd finish up with, should I call it the lamest one? Or the one that you just won't notice as big of a difference on? I will say be super aware of the difference between this one on its own and this one within that diphthong, or when there's an R after it, as we'll talk about later. And I did mention that this is kind of the last of the diphthongs. Sometimes people talk about one other thing as a diphthong, which I'll hit on for just a moment, which is the U. Some people call it the liquid U, like cute. And this is the Y sound before an oo. If I didn't use that and I said cute and I didn't have this, it would be coot. I've got cooties, right? So this sometimes people consider a diphthong. Now this is technically a consonant, but it is an approximant. I'm throwing terms at you and I apologize. It's an approximant, which is also sometimes called a semi-vowel. So maybe we could consider this a semi-diphthong. And the big thing with that one, which I'll get into later, the big thing with that one is the fact that, in some countries they do more liquid U's than what Americans do. Like, I say cute and beautiful, but I say news. Whereas some speakers will say cute, beautiful, news. I tend to do it without that. So it's coot and bootiful and news. Not really. Cute, beautiful news. There you go. Little bit of an intro, even though I went off in another direction, to the choice diphthong, the last of the 5 diphthongs that we're doing a deep dive on. If you want more info about learning accents and digging into phonetics more, you can check out the materials at accenthelp.com. You can look at the Generican materials that really dive into the phonetics and also into a relaxed Generican, generalized American accent, generic American. So a relaxed Generican or an elevated Generican accent, or even that trans-mid-Atlantic sort of accent, where you can find those materials on accenthelp.com along with 50 other accents.